Good evening, CLA family. This is Alan Dykoff coming to you once again from my office at my house among this virus COVID-19 issues where we can't meet at church. And so Pastor John has asked me to teach again the Bible study this Wednesday, and I really enjoy doing it. I hope you guys enjoy it. And I told him I would. Uh, so, before we get started, I wanted to share with you a little testimony uh, that I had tonight, a miracle, I think, I believe. I was out trying to, my backyard is kind of a mess and we're trying to fix it up. And so I was weed eating, weed whacking it yesterday, and I cut down all the weeds, and I was trying to get the lawnmower back there tonight. And I take the lawnmower back there, and I go to pull the cord to start it, and the cord comes off in my hand. Right, it comes off of the lawnmower, and I thought at first that the cord broke. I thought, oh no, I'm not going to be able to do it, and I really need to get these weeds up because our dogs get in it, and there's foxtails in it, and it gets in their mouths and ears, and causes us money to get the dogs worked on to get the foxtails out of them. So I'm like very frustrated at this point, and it was later in the evening. It was like 7 o'clock or so. I only had about half an hour of light left in the day to get the job done, and I'm thinking to myself over and over in this time, there's no way I'm going to get this done. But I knew how to take apart the top part of the lawnmower to get to the spool where the um, cord goes in, and it's kind of difficult sometimes to fix those things. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. And I'm thinking several times in this process, there's no way this is going to work. But I knew a next step I could take. I could take it apart and then look and see if I could do something and then go to the next step. So anyway, I did that, and I took it apart, and I saw that the cord had not broken. It had just, the knot in the end of it had come out of the spool, but it had to be threaded into a very narrow hole and through a passageway that was very narrow. And I thought, there's no way I'm going to be able to thread that cord in through that passageway to get it back on the spool. Well, because it was, fuzzy on the end where the knot had come off. And so I went and I got a lighter and I burned the end of it to try to get the fuzzy part off of it. And then I had this big blob of nylon goo on the end of the cord, and that wouldn't even fit through the hole. So then I get my knife out and I'm sharpening it like you sharpen a pencil with a knife or whittle a stick to try to get it to a point. And I'm thinking in my head, well, I just burned this to take that fuzzy stuff off. Now I'm cutting off the part that I burned. I'm going to be back to the fuzzy stuff. And so this isn't going to work. I'm thinking again, this isn't going to work, but I'm still trying. Well, I was able to sharpen it to somewhat of a point, and I stick it in the hole, and I'm like, it was just too long of a passageway for it to go through, and it was at an angle to get it through this hole. And I'm just telling myself, there's no way this is going to happen. Uh, it's impossible, really. I'm a decent mechanic, backyard mechanic, and I'm just in my own mind. I'm thinking, this is impossible. This is never going to work. But then, against all hope, I prayed. I said, Jesus, help me get this in there. I really need to get this yard done. And I said, Jesus, please help me. And no kidding, I pushed it in there, 3 or 4 times, and a little piece of it stuck out through the hole, and I couldn't, not enough of it stuck out I could get my fingers on to pull, but I saw it was there. I like almost had it, and I'm thinking in my mind, well, I should get some pliers or something, so if I can get this thing to stick out, I might be able to pull it. But I had it right there, and I'm like, I can't go around the house to the garage to get the pliers, or I'm going to lose this, getting the thread, the cord threaded through there. So I continue to poke it through, and I get it to stick out a little bit more. And then I take out my pocket knife and I'm able to actually scrape it and fish it through and pull it out. And right then I'm like, 2 or 3 times already, I'm thinking this isn't going to work and it's impossible. Yet I was able to just keep pressing on, and it was able to get it to work. And so I got the cord in there, and then I started putting it back together and realized, oh no, it's not wound up on the spool. It's at the end of the spool. I'm like, oh no, but I had felt so good and was thanking God that I was able to get the cord on there as far as I did. I'm like, he's not going to let me down. I'm starting to get confidence now, but then I'm still thinking, it's not wound up on the spool. So I found out that if I could just wind the thing backwards, the spring that winds it up was automatically ratcheting into place, and I was able to wind it up uh, and get it to go on there, and the spring mechanism still worked as it would ratchet on. And again, that was another obstacle that I thought, oh no, it's not going to work. But I got a small victory already, so I was feeling a little better about it. And anyway, I got it in there, I got it back together, and the lawnmower started on the first pull. So, and I was able to mow the yard that I was trying to do just as the sun was going down. So, uh, you know, fixing lawnmowers, and you might think that's a pretty small thing, but I was really extremely frustrated, and I was feeling like this is not going to work, and and all these tasks were kind of stacking up around me, and you might think that God doesn't care about small things like lawnmowers and helping you get a job done before the sun goes down, and having things pile up to the future, and additional jobs that you're going to have to do in the future. But uh, I'm here to say that God does care about those small things, and I truly believe that He helped me get that fixed. Even though does God fix lawnmowers? I don't know, but I know He helped me get that job done, and He could, I believe, knew the frustration that was building inside of me, and I just thank Him that He was there. He helped it again, like you say. I said it might be seem like a small thing, but uh, I believe He touched me. So I just wanted to share that with you. No job is too big or too small for our God, and I wanted to share that with you. So let's pray. God, we thank you for this time we have tonight, and God, please give me the words that you want for our congregation and for your people, Lord, as we study the story of Gideon, whom you use mightily in the Bible and in the time of the judges. And God, you're the same as you were yesterday, as you are today, and you are forever. And whether the victories be large or small, you are still able to bring victory. So we thank you for that. So, okay, everybody, we did Judges 4, 5, and 6 last week, and I kind of ran through 6 pretty quickly last time, and that's kind of really the beginning of the story of Gideon. And so I wanted to review a little bit of the end of chapter 6. If you go to Judges chapter 6, verse 14, this is when the angel of the Lord came to Gideon, and Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. The Midianites were invading Israel over and over and conquering them, and driving them into extreme poverty. So, and the angel of the Lord appears to Gideon, and he tells him he's going to go deliver Israel from the Midianites. So, in verse 14, after the angel tells Gideon this, uh, well, this is the angel talking in verse 14. And the Lord looked upon him and said, Go in this thy might, and thou shalt save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have not I sent thee? And so here, the angel of the Lord, or some people say this could have been a pre-incarnation of Jesus actually talking to Gideon, which is possible. But the angel is talking to him, and he tells Gideon, Go in this thy might. And I've wondered often, what did he mean by this thy might? I mean, Gideon was there threshing wheat in a wine press, and uh, what was his might? And I wonder if it was, well, he wasn't doing much, but he was doing what he could. He wasn't surrendering to the enemy that was attacking them, but he was kind of resisting, in that he was uh, threshing the wheat and trying to put together food for his family or his people the best way he could, even though it was a pretty minor uh, effort. He wasn't doing it in an efficient way, the way you would if you were in a free nation where you could do this out in the middle of the areas that would be the best place to do it. He was kind of hidden in a place doing it where it would have been very difficult, but he's still doing it. And again, he's pushing against the odds, and perhaps that is why the Lord picked him, because he found a man that, even though the odds were against him, he was still going to do what he could do uh, to uh, get the things done that he knew he needed to do. So, um, and then Gideon's answer in verse 15, he says, "Oh, my Lord, wherewith shall I save Israel? Behold, my family is poorer in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." So Gideon uh, is pretty humble. He's got a humble picture of himself, and it was probably a realistic uh, observation or assessment of his own situation. He said, his father's house was poor in Manasseh, which would have been the tribe of Israel that he belonged to, and he was least in his father's family. So he probably wasn't the firstborn or the strongest one in the family. Perhaps he was the youngest, and or maybe a middle child that was one of the weaker children in his family, and he could observed that his father's house, his family, was one of the poorer families among the tribe that he dwelt in. So he's like, God, how are you going to use me? My father's family is poor, and I'm one of the weakest one in my father's family. So in verse 16, the Lord answers him and says, "Surely I will be with thee, and thou shalt smite the Midianites as one man." So the Lord answers back to him and says, "Look, your limitations don't bother me. Surely I'm going to use you." And kind of ignores his, pity party for himself. And he says, "Look, I'm going to use you, and it's going to happen, and you're going to smite them the way, this whole huge army, you're going to smite them as if they were just one man." Um, so then Gideon asks the angel, if you're from the Lord, please let me give you a present. And he goes and prepares him a sacrifice. He goes and gets a kid and kills it, or maybe it was dead already. He had the meat, I don't know, but he prepares the meat, and he brings unleavened bread and some broth, and he brings it out to the angel. And the angel says, "Put it on this rock here." And the angel touches the rock with the staff that was in his hand, and he poured the broth on the meat and the bread, and fire comes up out of the rock and burns up the food that Gideon had brought for the angel. And then the angel disappears from him, or I don't know how it went away, but it just says the angel departed. And then Gideon's like, "Oh no, I'm going to die because I've seen God face to face." And the Lord answers him, "Don't worry, you're not going to die." Uh, but I thought that was an interesting response from Gideon. Oh, that was God I was talking to, and now I'm going to die because no man can see God face to face and live. Um, so the angel does this, and the first thing Gideon does is he goes to his father's house, and I talked a little bit about this last week, that his father had an altar to Baal on his property, and a grove of trees, which I think was part of the uh, part of the service or this ritual, that they would use these grove of trees when they were worshiping Baal. And uh, Gideon cuts down. God tells him to destroy this altar to this false god Baal. And Gideon gets, I think I said last week, 10 of his best friends, and I read it closer to yesterday, and it was actually 10 of his servants. So 10 of his servants, perhaps they were his friends too. And he goes by nighttime, and he cuts down this grove of trees, or this garden, and uh, he destroys the altar of Baal, and he burns a bullock to the Lord. Uh, and he does it at nighttime because he's afraid of the men of the city, that they will kill him if they see him destroying this altar of Baal. And the men of the city come out the next day, and they say, "Who tore this altar down and cut the trees down?" And this was on his dad's property, so it's odd, you think he would have the right to do whatever he wanted to on his own property. But the men of the city were mad, and they found out it was Gideon, and they said, "We're going to kill him," And Gideon's dad comes out and defends him and says, "Well, if Baal is really a god, let Baal defend himself. Why do you have to, take Baal's part? Let Baal, if he's really a god, let him kill Gideon." And so he defends him, and Gideon lives, and uh, this is his first victory, essentially. I thought it was interesting because he destroys this altar that was on his father's property, his dad's property, And it's kind of like God was telling him, clean up your own house at home. If God's going to use him as a mighty man to go out and deliver Israel from the Midianites, he's got to clean out the false gods that are in his house. And so, and there's a scripture in the New Testament, I believe, that says judgment begins at the house of the Lord. So I think that's totally legitimate, that we got to clean up our own house first. How do we expect God to use us uh, if we don't have our own house in order? So if we've got secret sins or things like that that are in our hearts or minds or lives, we need to clean those up, and we become useful to God when we're a clean vessel. He can use us then. So that's kind of what I get out of that is his first act of God moving upon him was destroying this altar of Baal that was in his own family, and so he did that, and God delivered him. So it's a small victory. He destroyed the altar of a false god, and he didn't get killed for it. Right? That was the victory. So uh, he gets the victory there in small, and then in verse 33 of chapter 6, still it says, "Then all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the children of the east were gathered together and went over and pitched in the valley of Jezreel." So these, um, I don't know if some of these peoples overlap, but he mentions three groups of people here: the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the people of the east. And so, in my mind, that could be perhaps a conglomerate of three different nations of peoples that are gathered together in this big army that's coming against Israel. And it was a huge army. It said the Midianites alone were like the sand of the seashore, and they came up like grasshoppers. And in the next chapter, it does give a number of the children from the east, and it's a huge number. If these other two groups are the same number of those, this would have been a huge army. So um, they come up against them in verse 34. It says, "But the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, and Abiezer was gathered after him." So uh, these armies are gathered together against Israel, and the Spirit of the Lord comes upon Gideon, and he blows a trumpet, and perhaps it was like this. This is a shofar, and you can blow it like that. And perhaps they had a bigger one, and it would have been loud, but that was a common thing for them to gather people together. You would blow a trumpet, and people knew what the blowing of the trumpet meant. Now there's an announcement going to be made, or the king's going to say something, or they would use it to guide armies into battle. That they would have trumpeters, and the trumpeters would blow a certain tune, and that would tell the armies what action they were supposed to take. So Gideon blows his trumpet, and he starts building this army because the Spirit of God is moving on him, and uh, this big army is gathered against them, and God is moving in Gideon and moving him to put this army together. And it's interesting. It says um, that Abiezer uh, came with him. So kind of immediately when Gideon starts to put this army together, God provides him a partner or somebody that can encourage him and counsel him. This Abiezer, and I don't know if that was a whole tribe or just one person, but I tend to think it was a tribe. And then a lot of the other tribes of Israel begin to gather together too. So but I thought it was nice that and really interesting that whenever Gideon began to move, God brought someone close to him to help him almost from the start. Um, so he sent messengers out, and he builds this big army. And uh, in verse 36, it says, "Gideon said to God, if thou wilt save Israel by my hand, as thou hast said, behold, I will put the fleece out." And that gets us to the kind of famous story of Gideon putting out the fleece. And so he put out this wool fleece, which would have been like a sweater or a mat of some type. Uh, and he asks God, well, if you make the fleece wet in the morning with the dew, but all the ground around it is dry, I'll know that it's you that is sending me, stirring me up to go fight this battle. And he gets up the next morning, the fleece is wet, and he wrings it out and gets a bowl full of water out of it, and all the ground around is dry. And then he starts thinking in his mind, I think, well, that could have just been the way the weather pattern, the dew happened last night. So, in order to make sure, he asks God again. He says, God, please don't be angry with me. I'd like to ask you one more time for one more sign. I'm going to put the fleece out again, and this next time, let the fleece be dry and all the ground around be wet. And he puts it out, and the next night, that's exactly what happens. The fleece is dry and all the ground around is wet. So he knows that wasn't just a coincidence of a weather, phenomena that happened the way the dew fell, because it flip flopped from night to night. And if it was a weather thing, it would do the same thing each night. So now he knows that it is God. He asked for the sign. He asked for a double confirmation on the sign, and he gets it. And now he knows, okay, this is God indeed telling me to go out and go to this fight. So uh, he goes out to the fight, and you guys, I think, probably know the story. Uh, he has a small army of about 32,000 people, and God says, this is too many people for me to gain a victory in, because I know the men of Israel will be big headed and arrogant and say, oh, we won this battle on our own. And he actually says they would vault themselves against God in verse 2 of chapter 7. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people that are with thee are too many for me to give the Midianites unto their hands, lest Israel vaunt themselves against me, saying, mine own hand hath saved me. So when we take credit for something God did, we actually are opposing God. We're vaunting ourselves against God. So God didn't want to give them the opportunity to even have a chance to say that. So he says, you've got too many people. And he tells Gideon, tell everybody, if anybody's afraid of this battle, you can go home. And so they had about 32,000 people, and 22,000 go home. So Gideon's left with 10,000 to face this huge army. And I think this army was in the hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the other side of these armies that gathered. So, they were already outnumbered, 10-1 probably, and 2/3 of their army goes home. And God comes back and says, no, that's still too many. You got 10,000. That's still too many for me to get the credit for this battle. So he tells them, go down to this area where there was water and tell the guys to get a drink. And he says, the ones that bring the water up to their mouth with their hand and lap it like a dog, separate them out from those that bend down on their knees, I guess, and, stick their face in the water to drink. And so it turns out only 300 of this 10,000, bring the water up to their mouth and lap it like a dog. And God says, keep those guys, send everybody else home. So Gideon has gone from this army of 32,000 down to 300 men. And God says, yeah, that's what I need to get this victory. So they go into the battle, and the night before, well, that very night, actually, after God picked these men, God tells Gideon, okay, we got what we need, let's do it. And he tells Gideon, go down to the camp of the enemy, and if you're afraid to go down to the camp, sneak in like a spy and see what they're saying, and I will encourage you. And he says, if you're afraid, take your servant with you. So Gideon goes down and takes his servant with him into the camp at nighttime. And, I picture, there's a tent there, and he kind of is lifting up the flap of the tent from underneath the back of the tent or whatever, and he's listening, and he hears the guys in the tent say this. We're in chapter 7, verse 13 now. And when Gideon was come, behold, there was a man that told a dream unto his fellow and said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and lo, a cake of barley bread tumbled unto the host of Midian, and came into the tent, and smote it that it fell, and overturned it, that the tent lay lay along. And his fellow, 14, and his fellow answered and said, this is nothing else save the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel, for unto his hand hath God delivered Midian and all the host. So Gideon sneaks into the enemy's camp and he's eavesdropping to listen to what they're saying. And one guy says, I had this dream that this loaf of barley rolled into the camp of the Midians and it knocked the tent down, laid it flat. And the guy who's explaining the dream to says, that's Gideon. I know that's Gideon. How these guys knew that, I don't know. And how they heard of Gideon, I'm not sure. But they had heard of him. And Gideon's over, eavesdropping, listening to this conversation. He hears, these guys are terrified of me already. Haven't even done anything. And they're on the run. It reminds me of the story when the spies came into Jericho and they stayed with the harlot Rahab. And she said, the men of the city here are terrified of Israel because they've heard what God has done for Israel in Egypt and how he parted the Red Sea for them and destroyed Pharaoh's armies. And all the men's hearts melt in Jericho. So the Israelites knew that the men of Jericho were already terrified and scared of them, and that gave them courage and to win the battle. And in the same way here, Gideon finds out that the men are already scared and terrified of him because God was sending them dreams, I guess, and so this was another confirmation in Gideon's mind that, hey, God is moving and he's gone before me. The Bible says the Lord will go before you. And he went before him and fought the battle before Gideon even got there. So Gideon comes back to his army of 300 men. He says, okay, boys, this is time to go. He said it was the middle watch of the night, which I think is probably midnight to 3 in the morning sometime. And so it would have been very late at night, and the enemy probably mostly would have been all asleep. And Gideon says, okay, let's get ready for the battle. And in verse 16, chapter 7, he says, and he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet in every man's hand with empty pitchers and lamps within the pitchers. So here's Gideon. Okay, we're going out to war. Here's your weapons: a trumpet, a jar, and a lantern. And the guys are like, "Where's the sword? Don't we get bows and arrows? A shield. What? Weapons of war: a trumpet, a jar, and a lantern." So interesting. God's weapons are not the same as our weapons, right? So he prepares them with his weapons because the battle is the Lord's, and in this situation, it literally is the Lord's. The men did not have to lift a finger to win this battle. So Gideon tells them, he divides the 300 men into 3 groups, and I picture this as a valley with hills around it, and the Israelites, the 300, 100 on each hill, on 3 sides like a triangle, and they've all got their lantern hidden in a jug, in the jar, and a trumpet. And so they get on the hill, and Gideon says, whatever I do, you do. So Gideon blows the trumpet, and they all blow their trumpets. And 300 trumpets would be kind of a loud noise. And like I said earlier, the trumpet was used as a form of communication in these armies. And so you might have had one trumpet for 100 men, 100 soldiers, and they would all be within earshot of that trumpet. So when that trumpet sounded, that 100 men would know it was time for them to move. And then the next group over would have another 100 men with the trumpet there. So when the Midianites hear 300 trumpets blowing, they're probably in their minds thinking there's 100 guys for each one of those trumpets. That's like 30,000 troops coming after us in the middle of the night. And so they blow the trumpets, and that wakes all those guys up, and they're like, oh, there's an army out there, and we can't see them. It's dark. And then they break the jars, and so they hear glass breaking and pottery crashing, and they're like, oh no, they're in the camp already. They're beginning to attack us. And then they see all these lights come on when the jars break, all these lights, and they're like, oh, look, they're on the hills all around us. We're surrounded, and they're rushing. They think they're rushing in. Well, the Bible says they all stood still, right? If you look in verse 20, and the 3 companies blew the trumpets and brake the pitchers and held the lamps in their hands. to blow withal, and they cried, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." And in verse 21, and they stood every man in his place round about the camp, and all the host ran and cried and fled. So they all stood in one spot and blew their trumpets, and they said, "The sword of the Lord and of Gideon." It's interesting. Um, they said the sword of the Lord, but did they have swords made out of metal? Metal swords weren't one of the things that Gideon gave them. He gave them a pot, a pottery, a lamp, and a trumpet, and they didn't have a sword, but they said it was the sword of the Lord. Well, what was the sword? The sword of the Lord was their words, and their words were the sword of the Lord. All they had was words. Well, we know that the word of God is the sword of the Spirit. So what they spoke was the word of God, and it was a sword for them. And the enemy was totally panicked. They think they're being ambushed by a huge army in the middle of the night, and they begin to get up and just start swinging their swords, thinking the enemy is among them, and they all kill each other. And so this huge army begins to, turn against itself because they can't see. And Gideon and his army are up on the hills, just standing still, and these guys are all in the valley, just destroying each other. And so God wrought this great victory through Gideon, and the men didn't even have to swing a sword to make it happen. So uh, that gets us through, I think, chapter 7. It's interesting. At one point, they chased two of the kings. So they killed most of each other off, and then Israel did begin to pursue after them, the remnant that was left, and they chased them out, and they killed a few of their kings. And it's interesting. One of the tribes of Israel, uh, Ephraim. They chase a couple of the kings there, and Ephraim captures these two kings of the Midianites, and they kill them. And then Ephraim comes to Gideon and says, "Hey, how come you didn't come call us to this battle?" They get mad at him because he didn't call them. And in reality, Gideon probably could have said, "Well, you would have got sent home anyway because we sent 90% of the troops home anyway." Uh, but they were mad at him because he didn't come and call them to this battle. And yet they did kill these two kings, Ephraim did. And so Gideon uses that as his defense. Hey, you killed the two greatest kings of the Midianites. So what have I done compared to what you've done? And kind of strokes their ego a little bit, I think, because they seem to be kind of vain men. And he says, "Hey, you killed their two greatest kings, so you did better than I had done." And then that pacifies their anger, and they get along with him. But it's kind of funny. He gets opposition from his own people that are help win the battle, and they're like, "Well, we didn't get to do enough." So I thought that was pretty interesting. Um, okay, that gets us up to chapter 8, and one of the things that happens in chapter 8 is Gideon takes some of the spoil, which was golden earrings from these guys, and he makes an ephod with, I think, is like a little false god. So I thought that was really odd that God uses Gideon to have this great victory, and then he builds this little statue, a false god, and it says that was a curse to his family from that time on because Israel went a whoring after other gods with this ephod that Gideon had made. So very, I think it kind of shows us that God can use us even if we are imperfect. Gideon had faults, and he wasn't totally right with God, I think, in some ways, because he made this false God. Um, but and then in about verse 30 of chapter 8, it says, "And Gideon had 70 sons of his body begotten, for he had many wives." So in addition to making this false god, Gideon had multiple wives, and God told Israel that they were not to do that, that they weren't supposed to have multiple wives. Although the culture, it was more or less acceptable to have more than one wife, but uh, at least he told them they shouldn't have many, and Gideon did, and so he had 70 sons, and it doesn't tell us how many daughters he had, but if he had 70 sons, I would think he had a lot. But and then he had even a concubine on top of that. In verse 31, it says, "In his concubine that was in Shechem, she also bare him a son whose name was called Abimelech." And so he had all these wives, and in addition to the wives, he had concubines too. And he had 70 sons, and then this concubine had a son also. And uh, I maybe Gideon was thinking when he was old, and it says he died of a old age, and he ruled Israel for 40 years, and so that was good. Gideon did a good job, and he ruled Israel the way God wanted him to. At one point, they come to him and say, "We want to make you our king." And in verse 22, and Gideon answers them in verse 23, and he says, "I will not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." So here Gideon gets it perfectly right. The people wanted to make him a king, and he's like, "No, we don't have a king in Israel. God is our king, and that's the way God wanted it." And Gideon saw that perfectly, and he had that part accurate. Yet he had these other areas where he didn't seem to be doing too right in. But but he did die of an old age. He lived to be a good old age, it says, and uh, he had all these sons, and I would think in Gideon's mind, he's like, "Oh, I've got all these sons. They're going to, prosper in Israel for a long time." Well, it's not so. This Abimelech uh, turned out to be evil, and he came and persuaded the men of Shechem to follow him, and they went back and they killed all 70 other sons of Gideon. So even though Gideon had all these sons, and he, possibly thinking, well, they're going to be strong in the future. He came from a poor family, but he's going to send his sons forward as a small army of men here, and they would have a good future. I would think he would be thinking that. But the one son from the concubine comes and persuades a small group of men to come with him, and they come and they kill all 70 of Gideon's other sons. So um, it didn't work out for things the way I think Gideon thought it would for his sons. Um, but one of his sons got away, one of the 70, I think, and his name was Jotham. So in chapter 9, verse 7, it says, "And when they told it to Jotham, he went and stood on the top of the mount of Gerizim, and lifted up his voice and cried, and he said unto them, Hearken unto me, ye men of Shechem, that God may hearken unto you." So he has a right view of this massacre that has happened, that these people have treated the house of his father very horribly, and killing all of his brothers except for him. And he basically tells them, "You're going to be judged for this." He says, if you did what was right, and all my brothers deserve to have this, then good for you, and I hope it all goes well with you. But if this was evil, uh, Abimelech is going to turn on you, and you're going to turn on Abimelech, and you're going to fight with each other and destroy each other. And that's essentially what happens in chapter 9. Abimelech rules these people for 3 years, and then it begins to all fall apart, and uh, his men turn on him, and they try to fight against him, and then he defeats them, and gains a small victory, but then he tries to go on to conquer another group of people that has a big tower, and they're trying to burn the tower down. They had burned one down before this. They try to burn this other tower down, which was greater, and a woman throws a piece of a millstone off of the top of the tower and hits Abimelech in the head and crushes his skull. And he turns to one of his servants and says, "Run me through with the sword, because I don't want people to say that I was killed by a woman." So his servant does him this favor and kills him by running him through with a sword. So he doesn't say that a woman killed him, but in reality, a woman killed him. A woman threw the rock off of the tower and crushed his skull. So anyway, it didn't go good for him. It, and that's kind of the end of the story of Gideon, and it's an incredible story to see how mightily God used him, and used him to do a great deliverance of Israel, but then he had these other issues in his life, and his family, kind of went through terrible things after that. And I don't can't explain it all. I don't understand it all myself, but um, it still shows how God can use us, and uh, if we're a willing vessel, and Gideon was, and he was willing to do what God told him to do, and he did it. So uh, God used him in a mighty way, and I think we should be the same way. We know we're not perfect, so we think maybe that makes us unusable for God. Because we know we're not perfect. Well, here's a good example of somebody who wasn't perfect, but God used him, and I have no doubt that Gideon made it to heaven despite his shortcomings, because God used him and he trusted in God. So anyway, that's all I have. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you later. And God bless you all. And hopefully we'll get to gather together soon. And I pray that God continues to protect us all during this virus, and that it doesn't affect any of us and any of our loved ones and friends and families here from Christian Life Assembly, and our extended families and brothers and sisters in the spirit as well. And thank you for your time and patience, and God bless you all, and have a good night.